Hey guys, my name is Joanna, also known as Just Another Flutist here on YouTube, and today we're going to do a slightly different spin on my Practice With Me series. Today, you will be sight reading with me. So a lot of you guys have been asking me, like, how am I sight reading things so quickly when I practice new things in front of you guys? And I realized that everything that's going through my mind is a little bit too much to explain in a practice with me, because in a practice with me, you guys are watching me actively practice the way I normally do. So I thought I might as well make another series, a separate series, where I actually talk about literally what is going through my mind when I read something for the first time. What we are going to be using today is Drouet's 72 studies on taste and style, composed expressly for the Bem flute and dedicated to Philip Ernst. Yes. A couple of reasons why I picked this. One is that it is public domain. It is on IMSLP. I will put a link in the bottom bar below for you guys to follow along. And also, I love the fact that at least the first few pages, these studies are quite short. Number one is only 3 lines long. This is perfect material for learning to sight read. It doesn't last forever. It's not too taxing on your brain. Your brain knows that there is light at the end of the tunnel. It doesn't have to like keep on its toes for like too freaking long. I'm going to have the music kind of like down here or something so you guys can follow along and see what I am talking about. Let us begin. The first thing I see is that there is no key signature. So I'm like, okay, this must either be C major or A minor. What I do then is I immediately look at the last note of the entire piece, of the entire study, and I see that it's C. So to me, I'm like, okay, I think that is like pretty good confirmation that this is in C major then. Then I look at the first note of the piece and I see that it's a G. Now this G is what's called the dominant note of the major scale. The major scale has names actually for each note in it. The first note is like the root note of the scale. That is called the tonic. It is the most important note of the scale because all of the other notes kind of like gravitate towards it. When you play other notes, it kind of wants to go back home to the root note, to the tonic. The 5th note of the scale is the dominant. It's called the dominant because it is the second most important note of the scale. I'm going to play a G to a C. Do you hear how that sounds like something's ended? Right? It works the other way around too. If you go from G to C, going down to C. Right? It sounds like it's ended. So those 2 notes, like the 5th note of the scale and the first note of the scale, those are the 2 notes that all the other notes kind of revolve around. The first note is a dominant and the last note is tonic. I'm thinking to myself, yes, this is indeed in C major. Now at this point, I think to myself, okay, if it's in C major, my brain automatically kind of like programs my fingers to want to play in C major. In my head, I've basically already done this. Immediately. That's where my fingers want to go because I know I'm in C major now. Next, I look at the time signature. Now the time signature here, you see that C. Normally we're taught that the C stands for common time, but actually it's sort of morphed over time. It actually used to just be a semicircle. The semicircle was one of what was known as mensuration signs. They're kind of like the time signatures from like a long time ago before time signatures like were fully developed. There were 4 mensuration signs. There was a circle with a dot. There was a circle. There was a semicircle with a dot, and then there was a semicircle. A circle or a semicircle meant that you broke up the entire bar into either 3 large beats or 2 large beats. If it was a circle, it was 3 large beats. If it was a semicircle, it was 2 large beats. Then the dot in the middle, if you had the dot, it meant that you divided each of the big beats into 3 smaller beats. If the dot wasn't there, it meant that you divided each of the big beats into 2 smaller beats. So in this case, it's a semicircle without a dot. So you take the bar, you split it into 2 big beats, right? Because it's a semicircle. There's no dot. So that means that you divide each of those big beats into 2 smaller beats. So how many beats do you end up with? 4. So that's why this semicircle here is equivalent to the time signature 4/4. The top number telling you how many beats there are in a bar, the bottom number telling you what type of note gets a beat. I like to read the bottom note as kind of like the bottom number of a fraction under 1. So if you were to take the 4 out in 4/4, the bottom 4, take it out, put it under a 1, it becomes 1/4. And what's another name for 1/4? Quarter. Therefore, the type of note that gets 1 beat is a quarter note. You can do this for, like, let's say if it's 4/8, take out the 8, put it under a 1, becomes 1/8. Eighth note is the type of note that gets 1 beat. And you can do this with any of the numbers that you'll see on the bottom of time signatures. Because I know that it's in 4/4, I think to myself, okay, then that means I need to anticipate a more kind of boxy sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, do you notice how I am beating it? I'm not going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, I'm not giving each beat the same amount of emphasis. I'm giving the most emphasis on the first beat, a slightly lower emphasis on the third beat, and the second and fourth beats are both very weak. Bum, 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 bum. Now, do you notice there's a little bit of a lilt now when you do that? Bum, 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 bum. But it's sort of like a boxy lilt. It's not like a 3/4. 3/4 is bum, 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 right? 3/4 sounds a lot more round, right? Whereas 4/4 sounds a little bit more boxy. Bum, 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 bum. And you notice I'm not using numbers to count. Now let's look at the first 2 bars. The first 2 bars I immediately read as a floofed up version of half a scale, starting from the G down to the C. That F sharp you see there, I'm reading as the lower chromatic neighbor note of G. The A I am reading as an upper neighbor note, regular neighbor note. If we do that while reading these 2 bars and we're fitting it into our little lilt that we've got going on, bum, 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 you'll get this. The next 2 bars are basically actually the same as the first 2 bars, but this is what you call a sequence, is when you get the same thing, but it's either like up 1 or 2 notes or down 1 or 2 notes or something of that kind of pattern. We're basically going to do the same thing, but shift everything up. So that G sharp again is a lower neighbor note to the A. That B again is an upper neighbor note to the A. Here's the fun part, is like what I see there from the E to the D, those 16 notes are really just like floofed up little decoration. You're going down to the D, which is a neighbor note, lower neighbor note of E. You skip up to the F, which is an upper neighbor note of E, and before you come back down to the E. So those 16 notes there, don't read them as like individual notes. You want to kind of read them like en masse, like they're one unit. All you're doing is you're adding a little bit of ornamentation to the E. You're going down 1 note, you're all skipping up to the note above it, and then coming back down to the E before you resolve on the D. When I read the 3rd and 4th bars, it'll sound like this. So the next few bars, again, I'm just reading them just pretty much straight in C major. We got C major going down from the D, going down to the E, going back up to the E, and then we're doing a C major arpeggio coming down. We'll land on the D on measure 7, skip down to the G, come all the way up, still in C major, going up to the D, back down to the F, and then it resolves G, F, E, which is in the chord of C major. So let's play this. Now, did you notice something? Did you notice that there's a typo in there? In measure 5, that high D should have a dot next to it. It should be a dotted quarter. Now, how did I figure this out? Is because I'm reading the bar as a unit. Because I know this is in 4/4, I can see that this bar is split up into a neat half, right? And so that B that you see there in that bar should land squarely on the 3rd beat. Now, if you were to play this as written, you would end up playing the C on the 2nd beat. And then you'll realize that you'll have to like wait a little longer before you even get to the B. But that's not as written. That C should only be an 8th note. Therefore, this is a typo. Therefore, that high D should have an extra eighth note duration attached to it in order for this to actually work out correctly. So this means that if you have a very strong underlying kind of like internalized beat, you'll catch things like this a lot more easily, right? Because it suddenly becomes very obvious in the way that you play. I just wanted to explain a little bit of how I read measure 7 to 8. Measure 7 I actually read as like a floofed up version of what's called the dominant 7th chord. It's exactly what the name suggests. It's a chord that you build on the dominant note of the key. So the key here is C major, the dominant note is G. We're gonna build a chord on that G. So you always stack a third and then another third to build a chord, okay? So if we take the G and we stack a third above it in the key of C major, you'll get a B. Stack another third on top of that, again in the key of C, you get a D. Dominant 7th means that you stack a 7th on top of the dominant. Coincidentally, when you do that, it means that you just stack another third on top of what you already have. Again, within the key that you're in. So if you stack another third on top of D, because we have G, B, D, we get F. If you look at this bar is actually just a floofed up version of that, you see? Because you start on D, you jump down to the G, rip up to high D, and then you come down to F. The B in this chord is actually implied via the scale that you see written there. And so it's a dominant 7th going into what I'm reading as the first inversion of C major. So the first inversion of the C major tonic chord. Tonic, again, means it's the root note of the scale. The root note of the scale here is C. If you build a chord on top of it, stack a third, you get an E. Stack another third, you get a G. Again, we're all within the key of C major, right? Then what you can do is that you can actually flip the root note up 1 octave. If you do that, you'll end up starting on E instead, going to G, and before you actually play a C. These are called inversions because you're basically inverting it up. I'm reading measure 8 as like a whole unit, and I'm seeing G, E, and the E is underneath the G, and the C is kind of implied that we are in the key of C major. So I am reading measure 7 going to measure 8 as a dominant 7th chord on G that is then going into a C major chord in the first inversion. That's legit how I read it, and I read it immediately like that. Like, I recognize it immediately. What is this called? This is actually a type of cadence. A cadence is like a chord progression at the very end of a phrase, and it always sounds like it's ending in some way. It's cadencing. If I play measure 7 to 8 again, you'll hear what I mean. It very much sounds like the end of the phrase. All right, so that's what we have so far. We're gonna keep going. The next bar is a straight C major scale. We're good with that. Next bar, we're in the key of C major, but we are primarily going from the low A to the high A back down to the low A. In this case, what you'll need to do is, 1, recognize that you're basically playing A natural minor there, right? Because A natural minor is the relative minor of C major. You can take any major key, start with the first note, count up to the 6th note. If you start with the 6th note, go up 1 octave to the 6th note again, come back down to the 6th note, you will have played what's called the relative minor of that major key. So A minor is the relative minor of C major. So what you need to do here is anticipate that this bar here is going to sound a little bit more minor, but it has that natural minor sound where the end of the scale doesn't have that like half step between the 7th note and the 1st note. Anticipate a natural minor sound in the 10th bar, and then in the 11th bar what we have here is we're back to G. So G is again the dominant of C, and then you see that G sharp there. That G sharp I'm reading as a passing chromatic note between the G and the A. It kind of adds a little bit more of crunch to the sound there. Just adds a little bit of extra character right there. Plus he's put accents there, so you know he really wants you to milk it for what it's worth. But essentially this whole thing is in the chord of G here. That chord continues through the next bar as well. Do you notice that if you read the 3rd to last bar and the 2nd to last bar as a unit, you can kind of see that it's sort of mapped out that G dominant 7th chord again, right? Do you see that G at the beginning of the 11th bar, that B at the end of that bar, then a D at the beginning of the next bar, and then an F on the third beat of that bar. So it kind of maps out that G dominant 7th again. G, B, D, F, and then everything else is like floof around it. In the second to last bar, those 16th notes, you're just doing a little kind of turn on the D. So you're going from D up 1 neighbor note, back down to the D, then down 1 chromatic neighbor note down to the C sharp, and then D. And then you jump up to the F because you're completing the chord, right? That E that you see at the end there is more of like an anticipation of the C chord coming up in the last bar. This is very typically done at the very last cadence of a piece. It sounds a little bit more dramatic. So if we were to play this all now, starting from the 9th bar, and there we have it. It's done. So at this point is when you would go back and fix your articulation, you'd fix some of your dynamics, but essentially you would have played the whole thing correctly. You would have played like all the rhythm correctly and stuff because you're going in feeling it correctly. When you're more advanced, and if you're not like me and trying to talk out literally everything I'm thinking, you won't be as distracted, and you will be able to nail the articulation correctly, and you'll be able to nail things like the accents and stuff that you see there. I'm just gonna tell you guys straight up, I want to continue this series because I feel like I end up talking a lot about topics that I don't normally think of to talk about in like a separate video. Let me know if you guys are on board with that. And also let me know what is the hardest thing you guys have had to sight read and how did it go for you guys? I know I've had to do some crazy stuff when I haven't had time to practice. I hope that was helpful for you guys. I hope it was insightful. And as usual, if you guys like this video, make sure you give me a big thumbs up and hit subscribe for new videos every Saturday. Make sure you hit the bell icon if you want to get notifications for every time I post. This is my last video, which I will put a link to up here for you guys. If you want to support me, head on over to my Patreon. Otherwise, you'll find me on my social media networks, which are listed down below. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye.